Hi there, this is Evan here from latinum.org.uk, and in this video I'm going to be discussing with you a paper by Andrew Becker called Non OCULIS SED AURIBUS, the ancient Latin schoolroom and learning to hear the Latin hexameter. So he says, scanning an hexameter line, as we usually teach it, is primarily a visual activity. Students look at the words, determining long and short syllables, and then they mark them on the page. If we do ask students to read the line, then we ask for heavy emphasis on the ictus, which I discussed in the previous video, which is the pulse, the verse beat, the verse accent, which is not the natural accent of Latin words. And this essay, writes Becker, outlines a practice that supplements our visual scanning as marked on the page by treating meter as an acoustic phenomenon right from the beginning. And the student can then move beyond scansion, visual scansion or oral scansion, to emphasize the natural accent of the Latin words. And then we can attune our students more easily to the music of Latin hexameter verse. And then he refers here to this theory, the pulse beat theory of Latin verse, that we can attune students to the interplay of the verse pattern and the Latin words with their accents. So I don't think this is possible to do. I think you either do one or the other. You pay attention to the ictus when you're composing the poem, it's the structure, but when you are reciting, you're paying attention to the emotion and the other things, the sound of the words, the feeling that's conveyed in the texture of the language. But you're not analyzing the structure any less than we would analyze the structure of a Beethoven symphony while we are listening to it. I mean, you can study music theory, but when you listen to the symphony, you're still listening to the symphony. The idea here, he says, is to give an approximation of the practice of Roman teaching of the first few centuries AD. The steps for a modern student will be, first, to attend to the natural word accent. And this is why I stress the importance of reading an enormous amount of Latin aloud, paying careful attention to the location of the stress. Because in Latin poetry, stress is very important. Yes, Latin is a quantitative language, and the Romans wrote their poetry quantitatively under the influence of the Greeks. But the natural underlying basis of the Latin language is stress-based, and the native poetry of the Romans was stress-based poetry. And we find in Roman poetry, stress is actually quite important. Quantity is important too, but so is stress. Natural word stress, that is. So it would be assumed, of course, that ancient students of Latin living in Roman times would have just known the natural stress of the words, and then they would have used the ictus, the beats, to scan a line and to break it up into its feet acoustically. And finally, they would pronounce the line with the beat latent, in other words, ignoring it, and the natural word accent being the way that you would read it, that would be dominant. You wouldn't be paying attention to the ictus. But these three steps assume that students will learn, or will have learned to distinguish orally and orally long syllables from short syllables, whatever that means, or tense syllables from lax syllables. The use of verse beats to scan a line is built in ancient and modern times on the foundation of the quantitative pattern of Latin poetry. Becker writes that it's been useful in his practice before starting these steps to focus the student's attention on the oral and oral base of poetry. And here we can use the modern poets. And I recently discovered the Elizabethan quantitative poets, and these poets are extremely useful because they give you an idea of the feeling that should be there when you're reading the Latin. as poetry for its emotional value, and not just as a technical exercise. And he quotes Kenneth Koch: "If we take the idea of poetic language seriously, it can be defined first as a language in which the sound of the words is raised to an equal importance to the meaning of the words, and also equally important is the grammar and syntax of the words." And Becker writes that poets have been telling us such things for many years. If we marshal their authority before we begin exercises in Latin verse, our students may be more inclined to accept the importance of sound. And that's a fault of the classroom, of course. If a teacher reads things out loud and does lots of Latin out loud, then having to justify the importance of the sound of Latin wouldn't be required. And we can note, says Becker, that Latin poetry should be considered acoustically because it was composed orally. As Latin poets would sound out their lines, they would say them to themselves aloud. They wouldn't sit down with a pen and work out the scansion. No, they would throw things around until it sounded right. And we can turn to the ways some ancient Roman teachers taught their students to hear the hexameter patterns. And this ancient pedagogical practice would help modern students feel they are approximating an ancient classroom, rather than just suffering an absurd exercise devised by the Latin teacher. And he's talking about here the ictal reading. And of course, in most classrooms, the ictal reading is the only reading that students are ever exposed to. And as a result, their natural word accents are all screwed up because they spent so much time reading words with the ictus being stressed without having spent a lot of time reading Latin prose, and so they don't have an innate automatic appreciation of where the natural accent should fall in the Latin. So, as young Roman or provincial students began to make sense of lines and rhythms in Virgil, their teacher would tell them to scan the verse, scandentes, by beating out the ictus, percutientes. Our sources describe scanning as giving an acoustic emphasis to the beat by snapping the fingers, crepitus digitorum, or by tapping the thumb, ictus pollicis, or striking the rhythm in some audible way, ferire. All of these words describe ways to teach students to measure and divide the line into feet, marking a verse beat, the first syllable of each foot in the line of hexameter. And the teacher is asking the student to scan the line not visually, but aloud in some way. When Priscian, for example, instructs students scande versum, in other words, scan the line, they are not to read the words as they are, but redivide the syllables to break the line into feet. So, armavirumque canotriae qui primus saboris. Scanning aloud in Latin hexameters, as taught by Priscian, can be described as an exercise in which students will treat a foot as a word, and then they'll put the audible stress on the metrical ictus rather than the natural word accent. But, in contrast, for reciting or reading the Latin verse as performance poetry, so-called, then pronouncing the natural word accents. Remember that Latin poetry, and I'm going to stress this, was very popular. Everyone read it, from washerwomen to princes. And these people didn't have the technical education to scan a line. They would just read the poetry with a natural word accent, and the poem would fall into place. And that's all that was required. So, yes, if you're a music student studying music theory at university or at high school, you're going to learn all this underlying stuff. But it is possible to write music and compose songs without knowing any theory, but to analyze them, you need the theory. So this is the same thing. To analyze, you need it. It is possible to compose Latin poetry without knowing much theory as well, if you have a very good ear for quantity and stress. And as I said, the Roman poets, we do know, would compose their poetry aloud by sounding out verses and playing around with things. And it was the norm to read poetry this way, with the natural word accent, and there are some papyrus fragments that have been discovered where the natural word accent is there, so we know it was done. And there are various texts that support this from the Roman authors. I'm not going to go into those here. You can find this paper, Non Oculis Sed Auribus, online. If you just type in Non Oculis Sed Auribus, and then type file type, and then a colon, and then PDF, and do a Google search, it'll come up. Or if you typed in the English name, The Ancient Schoolroom, and Learning to Hear Latin Hexameter. So if you just typed in Ancient Schoolroom Latin Hexameter, file type, colon, PDF, then you would find this as well. So it's available freely online. So the evidence from the ancient teachers of meter suggests that this beat was not an ictus vocalis, out loud actually said by the person, a beat audible in reading or performing the verse, but rather an ictus mechanicus, a technique for learning, not for reciting, right? When we recite 1,000 lines of Virgil, we don't recite them all with right? We don't recite it with such a regular rhythm, because that would really send the listeners to sleep. And that wasn't the intention, right? So, but the structure of the poem has this regular structure, and this is an ictus mechanicus, a technique for learning to divide feet and distinguish meters aloud. And after some practice, the youth's ears will be attuned to the beats, and once they learn to recognize them acoustically, then they can go on to an actual reading of the poetry. So in short, the beats, the ictus, the percussio, the pulsus, were a way for students to measure and divide the line into feet, and to do so aloud as an exercise. This is not only ancient practice, but it's also the current scholarly opinion. So there were some scholars in the 60s that did promote this idea that the ancient reading was an ictal reading, but no modern scholars that I know of think this. So the relationship then between actus and accent and ictus is not an interplay of two independent patterns of sound, but, and here he brings up this idea that we have these two things going on, the interplay. The sound, the word accent, pays off the expectation of the verse beat. So, the modern classroom, this is what Becker proposes that teachers do, setting the stage for the student. He said we can teach the verse beats, dividing the meter aloud into feet, and then when speaking the lines, focus on the natural word accents. And he says, although analogies to one's own language are dangerous, sample lines from familiar poems in English have proven effective in illustrating how to discern the beats in the sequence of feet, and then reading with a natural word accent. And then such analogies can help students to notice the accents and beats in Latin. The Latin syllables and Latin accents. Before teaching the ictus of the Latin line, we must ensure that the students can hear the Latin word accent. And most students, he notes, would have come to Latin familiar with the word accents. Of course they would, unless they were Greek and they didn't know Latin poetry, or there were some little student in Judea who spoke Aramaic at home, and then his mother sent him to school and had Virgil thrust under his nose. Not a likely scenario, but one imaginable in a certain class of Romans. And a certain class of Jews living in ancient Palestine. One could imagine the upper classes being in this situation. Or they would have spoke Greek at home if they were highly educated, and not Aramaic, but still the same problem. So most ancient students, we can assume, were familiar with Latin word accents. And if you want to become good at reading Latin poetry, you need to read an enormous amount of Latin prose first. Prose comes first. Lots of it. Read aloud. So in a modern classroom, many students are not sufficiently comfortable. In fact, many Latin teachers are not sufficiently comfortable, and that's why they don't even do it. But that's another story. So it's not only students who have a problem, it's Latin teachers who have a problem. Are not sufficiently comfortable with the length of syllables and Latin accents. And they need to start with word shapes and blah, blah, going on, talking about that. Or you can go to latinum.org.uk and listen to my Latin audio and develop a natural, automatic appreciation for the Latin accent and quantity. And they need to know what makes a syllable long. They need to know the mute and liquid variability, how to divide syllables, and the position of the Latin accent, and that the enclitic probably shifted the accent, but maybe it didn't. And sometimes the poet may have chosen to shift the accent, sometimes not. And that elision does not usually change the accent, although it is a factor in dividing the line and in the verse beat of the ictal beat. So if students are not comfortable with accents, this initial focus will help them if they pay attention. So once again, he goes back to using the first line of the Aeneid. Many teachers tend to use this to analyze. So, arma virumque cano, Troiae qui primus arboris. And as I said, I don't think that Virgil had the accent on virumque. I think he had the accent on virumque, without shifting it. And if you read it, then you don't have this strange thing going on with cano. So, arma virumque cano is much more natural than arma virumque cano. It doesn't feel right. Arma virumque cano, Troiae qui primus arboris is how I think it should be read. And we have, of course, long, short, short, long, short, short, long, long, long. Whoops, I've lost track. Let's start again. So, long, short, short, long, short, short, long, 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 short, short, long, long. Or we can do it this way. Long, short, short, long, short, short, long, 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 short, short, long, long. That's probably a better way of doing it. So, accent and syllable length do not usually depend on verse pattern, but are features of the language, what we call tense syllables and lax syllables. And this step accordingly enhances the student's ability to think of the metrical line as a phenomenon anchored in real syllables of real Latin words and not an artificial abstraction. The problem is, of course, is that if you start to do ictal readings before you've mastered natural Latin word stress, you will learn the wrong stress on words and then end up pronouncing them incorrectly when you read them because you will have messed up your memory. So, Sacerdos was a Roman writer on the subject, and I'm not going to go into great detail here. He analyzes the reading of the first line of Virgil in some length. This is on page 10. I'm just scrolling through here. And he discusses Sacerdos and notes this about scansion. Hic tamen scire debemus, quod versus percutientes, it est scandentes, interdum accentus alios pronuntiamus, quam per singula verba ponentes, toro et pater, acutum accentum in to ponimus et in pa, scandendo vero inde toro pater, aneos in ro et in ter. So toro pater. So that's when you're scanning. When you're scanning, the accent moves, but not when you're actually reading poetically. So how should we know this? That when beating out the lines, this is the translation, scanning, sometimes we pronounce accents other than when we are placing accents on individual words. So toro, pater, we put the acute accent on to and pa, toro, pater. But when scanning, inde toro, pater, aneas, we place the accent on ro and ter. So toro, pater. Sacerdos uses accentus for both word accent and for ictus, which is the pulse accent, the one that's not expressed out loud, but the one that's dealt with mechanically. Nevertheless, he clearly describes two very different activities: pronouncing a line with a natural word accent and scanning the line with the ictus. So, if we were to read it with the ictus, we'd go in de toro pater aine asic orsum ab alto. So that's the ictal reading, percutientes, scandentes. But when they actually read the line, then it would be inde toro pater aneas sic orsus ab alto, which is the natural word accent. And there's no way you could read meaningfully with emotion if you are moving the accents around, because it would mess up your delivery. And then your poetry would sound incredibly mechanical and artificial. And no Roman would have read poetry except in a natural word order. So we put these two together and we can reconstruct a world of poetry in which the dominant accents played off the latent beat. This is this beat, pulse beat theory. I don't think that, yes, there is a play-off taking place, but it's something that's felt emotionally. So lines are smooth or they are rough, depending on this. And if we approximate this process with patience in a modern classroom, our students can perhaps, says Becker, begin to feel the conflict between accent and beat. See, I'm not so convinced that this conflict between accent and beat is necessarily needed to be felt, that the ictus is there as a means of construction, but the primary thing that the poet was interested in was the natural word stress, especially the Romans. And although they were applying this ancient Greek quantitative system, the natural poetry of Rome was stress-based. And when Romans read their poetry, this word stress was an important component of it, the natural word stress, which is why it is possible to read Latin poetry effectively in a medieval stress-based pronunciation, and in the restored classical, where some attempt is being made to differentiate the syllables which have vowels which are long by nature. But as Chomsky pointed out, the morphology of English and Latin is remarkably similar, which helps us, English people, when it comes to reading Latin poetry. So that's that. You can find this once again online if you search for the ancient schoolroom and learning to hear the Latin hexameter, and then type file type :PDF at the end of your search string. You will find this on Google. This paper was published by Becker in 2004 in the CPL forum online. Right, that's all. Thanks, bye.